as a society, we've done this extraordinary thing of extending life, but often by, on average, by about 30 years in the last decade and a half. I mean, that's an extraordinary achievement, but we've put way more attention into extending life than we have to figuring out well-being once we arrive.
Welcome to Zestful Aging, where I speak with fascinating people from all over the world, from every walk of life, who will inspire you to live with zest. I'm your host, Nicole Christina, and my mission is to bring you optimism about aging and help you make full use of the new opportunities that only come at this stage of life. To find out more about the podcast, hop on over to zestfulaging.com. And while you're there, sign up for my weekly email newsletter, The Insider, where you will get fun and quirky tidbits about the show and my exploits, including when I went python hunting in Florida and my participation in the National Senior Games. And if you love the podcast, I'd be grateful if you shared it with your friends. Our music is courtesy of Judy Banker, who was a previous guest on the show. Find out more at judybanker.com. And our technical director is Stephen Litweiler. Zestful Aging is all about being adventurous, and that's why I'm planning a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Finland, and I'm inviting you, my listeners. Why Finland? Well, it's been named the happiest country on the planet for the 6th year in a row, and if you like nature and design, you are in for a real thrill. We're going to start out in Helsinki with our private guide and work our way up to Lapland, where we will be treated to the Aurora Borealis and some of the most magnificent nature on the planet. There will be saunas, wildlife, snowshoeing, reindeer sledding, local food, and some of the cleanest water and air on the planet. We will learn what makes Finns so happy and how we can bring some of that back with us. Will it be cold? Yep, that's part of the adventure. The dates are January 22nd, 2024 to January 29th, 2024, and space is extremely limited. Find out all the details on my website, zestfulaging.com. I can't wait to meet you and share this once-in-a-lifetime experience. What is elder justice and why is it so important? And what is restorative justice and how does it work? Our guest today is M.T. Connelly, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient and founder of the Department of Justice's Elder Justice Initiative. MT conceived of and was the original architect of the Elder Justice Act, the first comprehensive federal elder abuse law. And as founder of the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative, she guided theory and strategy in large federal cases against nursing home chains for fraud, abuse, and neglect. And today we're going to talk sort of more generally about prevention and restorative justice. And I'm so happy to have you with us today. MT, thanks for joining.
Well, thank you for having me, Nicole. I'm happy to be here.
So you started as a prosecutor and now you're, it's much more, feels like it's prevention mode. You've written a book about aging. Can you tell me a little bit about that road for you going from a prosecutor now to prevention?
Sure. So, as you said, I started off as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, bringing civil fraud cases. And what I learned was that prosecution comes in very late in the game. So if we're looking at prosecution to solve big federal or national problems, we're coming in after the problem has happened, after the tears have been wept and the harm has been done generally.
Downstream, I think some people call that.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so what I have tried to do over the course of my work in aging is to move both my attention and the measures that I work for further upstream to help prevent problems before they even happen.
Can you tell me about some of the general problems? And forgive my ignorance, I just know a little bit about this, but in general, what are the kind of problems you were prosecuting and that are still in your focus right now?
Well, in terms of what was being prosecuted at the Department of Justice, which brings federal cases as opposed to state and local cases, those were mostly nursing home abuse and neglect cases brought under fraud laws, and then some big financial exploitation, telemarketing kinds of cases, that sort of thing.
I see.
But most of the prosecution of what's referred to as elder abuse happens at the state and local levels. Which have those kinds of prosecutors' offices have jurisdiction over other types of cases without getting too far in the weeds about that.
And that would be, you had mentioned telemarketing, and that is something, it's interesting. I actually had an experience where I guess I was targeted for that. And I had a friend who, it wasn't necessarily elder abuse, but it was a telemarketing scheme that was so sophisticated that her father, who had been extremely successful in all levels of business, fell for it. So I'm just thinking about the elders and how they may have vulnerabilities and how they're potentially really easy targets for some of this abuse.
Right. And I think one of the things we see is that, of course, everybody is being targeted for financial exploitation by scammers, but that they specifically target older people often, hoping, I think for a couple reasons. First, because in general, although there are many poor older people, wealth resides disproportionately with older people. And also there's some cognitive changes that can happen in aging that make people more vulnerable to scams, more likely to be trusting perhaps, or less comfortable with tech, or even feeling like they need to be polite to some caller who suddenly calls asking for help, or so that kind of creates a situation where there is a lot of financial exploitation by strangers of older people.
Yeah, I imagine that it would be hard not to get emotionally involved in some of these cases in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the money part, just looking specifically at financial exploitation, is super complicated for all sorts of reasons. In addition to what I just mentioned, money has a lot of symbolic freight. As you know from being a psychotherapist, it can be a proxy for love, or for self-esteem, or for social status. And so people assign all sorts of meaning to it. And it can be very complicated in families, too, about who feels entitled to what in terms of their parents' money. And so it plays on a whole bunch of different levels, some of them pretty subterranean and subconscious, which adds to it. And then there's, and I should have started with this at the beginning, which is that we are often loath to think about aging. We don't really, we want to get old, but we don't really do a very good job planning for old age often. And money is part of that. For example, taking stock of what you have and how you want to spend it through your old age, and or, planning, really thinking about, okay, what kind of housing or long-term care would you want? What's on the bucket list? What kinds of travel? Where do you want to spend it? What do you want to leave and to whom? So those kinds of things require real planning and thought, but that kind of planning and thought requires one to be willing to think about getting older.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because it really forces us to look at, there's an end to this party. I mean, I can't go to every single country I want to go to. It's just not feasible, or do every single cool thing that I haven't done yet. And it forces one to say, there's limits here, and it is out of my control. I can't buy more time, or, it's just really facing, I think, our mortality.
Yeah, I agree totally that it is facing our mortality, but it's also how we think about our time. Because as a society, we've done this extraordinary thing of extending life. But often on average, by about 30 years in the last decade and a half. And I mean, that's an extraordinary achievement, but we've put way more attention into extending life than we have to figuring out well-being once we arrive.
Now what do we do? Yes.
Exactly, because we want to get old, but we don't really want to be old, and we certainly don't want to think about being old. And so what that means, I think, is both that we underestimate aging's potential downside risks and upside potential. And that on both ends of that spectrum, it's really worth thinking more deeply about what it means to age and what we want out of that phase of life. And also how, as family members of older adults, how we want to arrange things as a family. As increasingly people are living deep into old age and needing more care and needing more assistance of all sorts. So I think the really important message is that we need to start paying more attention, both to the risks and to the potential upsides.
Yeah, being much more, I guess, mindful, for lack of a better word. So
word.
Interesting.
Hi, everyone. Have you listened to my interviews with Dr. Bill Rawls? He's been on the show twice, and after I read his book on cellular health and learned about his high standards for quality control, I was sold. I placed an order for Vital Plan supplements immediately. And I encourage you to learn about his work by hopping over to vitalplan.com. If you enter Zestful15, they will give you 15% off your first order. I'm excited for you to try these products. I think you're going to be very impressed. Now back to the show.
So, I was thinking, because I know you have been a caregiver, and you're obviously, you've written this book, your career has been really based on people in older age. What has influenced you most, if you can say, about how you're thinking now about aging and how we can do it the best way possible?
It's such an interesting question. I think I was supposed to be a doctor. My mother was a psychiatrist, and I thought that's what I was going to do. And then I started to see doing something called a resident volunteership at a big state psychiatric hospital. I lived there for 6 months and started thinking more about what kinds of structural change might be possible in terms of the mental health system. And so I decided to go to law school because I was really interested in, what the levers of change were more broadly. And so that launched me into law school. And then as I started to see aging, what became clear is that there are a lot of similarities, actually, because as you know better than I do, once we emptied out the state hospitals with deinstitutionalization, it was a noble idea, but we never created a community mental health system.
Right. We forgot the second half of that equation.
Exactly right. And that's really what people want and need. And so we know what people want and need, but we don't do it. And it's not dissimilar with aging. We know that most people don't want to go to a nursing home. They don't want to be in facilities. But we haven't really created a robust community-based system to help both older people and caregivers.
A social structure that people can. And that's the difference, I think. And Europe does that better than we do.
Yeah, all kinds of places do it better than we do.
Okay.
And what we're not, and one of the things, it's kind of astounding to me, given the numbers, how invisible this stuff is. But, there are, as people have gained additional years, people are living deeper into old age. We now have more than 6 million people who have dementia. And people, as we live deeper into old age, a lot more people need care. And where is that care coming from? Mostly from family. We now have more than 40 million what are called informal caregivers or family caregivers. That's a bigger population than the entire state of California. And that's an astounding number of people from whom we're expecting often very, very complex care and high medical care. And, Kathy Kelly, who runs the Family Caregiving Alliance, talks about it as a caregiving journey because it's often not a question of months, but a question of years with lots of different phases and, some of which are intensive medical care. And so, that was sort of a revelation for me about it's not just that we're getting older, but we don't have the infrastructure, the social infrastructure to support the aging society. And that's true in workforce, that's true in long-term care, that's true in financial security, that's true in housing. And it's true in sort of philosophy and ethics. We haven't really even figured out how to balance these really profound questions of autonomy and safety that are facing us as family members, as policymakers, and as a culture.
And does that make abuse more likely because we're not facing it and we don't want to look at it and nobody wants to feel like they're old?
Yeah, I think it does. I really think it does because, well, on all sorts of different levels, sort of at a practical level, just the caregiver example that I just mentioned. I mean, we're not helping people who often are in really dire straits and often aren't prepared for the job, are uneducated about really complex diseases like dementia and how to care for it, and often are very, very overwhelmed. And so that can, and sometimes one thing that happens in some families is that it's the person, an older person perhaps has been caring for a child or a grandchild or a niece or nephew who have substance use or mental health issues. And then as the older person gets older and needs care themselves, the role starts to shift. And the younger person, who is the person who is getting the care, is now being expected to provide the care. And that can work out until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it often goes dramatically wrong. And so that's, and it can take all sorts of forms of, abuse or neglect or financial exploitation. And that's the kind of situation where, where we could do a lot, I think, to prevent it if we provided individuals and families better support.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, and I'm really bastardizing it here, but this idea about your society is only as good as how it takes care of its most vulnerable populations.
Right? Exactly. I use that epigraph and an epigraph from Psalms um, in the book because
Hmm.
it's a real reflection on where we put our priorities and what's important
Mhm.
to us.
Yes. Could you talk, well, first, if you wouldn't mind defining restorative justice and talk about why it's different and why it's beneficial?
Sure. I think I'm going to rely on Sujatha Baliga, who's um, or rather Sujatha Baliga, who's a true expert and pioneer in the area of restorative justice. And the way she defines it is to say, rather than asking what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished, restorative justice asks, who was harmed, what do they need, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And so, really, the way that our justice system works is that it focuses on punishment. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
focus on who was harmed and how do we alleviate the harm and what needs to happen.
And that I understand that you have been involved in a restorative justice program that's been very successful in Maine. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I'd be happy to. I love talking about that. Um, so, so one of the issues in the elder justice field is that there are a few different kinds of fundamental flaws. One of them is that we don't have prevention or intervention data. And the simple way to say that is we don't know what works. So we put all these resources into a bunch of different programs, and we really have no idea, is one working any better than the other? And so I got together with some colleagues to essentially build a new kind of program that is more responsive to what people want and need, or say they want and need. And one of the issues is that we haven't asked older people or their families, like, how do you define success? What kind of help do you
Mm-hmm.
want when you're in trouble or your family's in trouble? And so the first phase was to ask clients of Adult Protective Services, which intervenes in situations where vulnerable adults are abused, neglected, or exploited. So it's a little bit like child protection,
Okay.
only that the older adults can decline services if they're deemed to have cognitive capacity. So in any event,
Okay.
so we started asking them, and a lot of people wanted help for a grandchild who had substance issues, for example, or a daughter who had some mental health issues. They didn't want to get them in trouble, but they wanted help for them. And most of our programs are not built to help someone else. They can say, what would you like? But not, would you like help for somebody else? And or would you like help to repair a relationship that's been breached?
Oh,
And
wow.
so what we did was build a program with this extraordinary nonprofit in Maine that focused on, it was sort of an add-on to Adult Protective Services, so that Adult Protective Services workers could refer cases to this nonprofit that could then say, what would you like? And could help other people in the client's lives, could help them repair relationships, etc.
So it's a more systems approach.
It's a systems approach, and it's a more holistic approach, and it's a more
Mm-hmm.
person-centered approach. It's asking the client, what do you want? It's not
Mm-hmm.
saying, okay, we have the following 3 things that we can do under law. It's saying, we want to follow your lead.
Wow.
And one of the things that's been really interesting is that, when people are in trouble, when older people are in trouble, and the cause of the trouble is perhaps a family member, once they can get help for that family member, then they can focus on their own needs. But until that happens, often that, they don't want to even focus on their own needs because that's the priority, is to focus on the other person's needs.
I see. And this is sort of a side question, but has the epidemic of opioid use and abuse had an impact on elder abuse?
It's a great question. And yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Although we only know that anecdotally because, again, we don't collect very much data.
I see.
But we have expanded the RISE program, which stands for Repair Harm and Relationships, Inspire Change, Social Support, and Empower Choice. That's what the RISC stand for. But yes, opioids are huge, and we have gotten recently another grant to look specifically at the role of substance use in these kinds of cases and figure out how can we better take those on.
So fascinating. You don't hear about that when you're hearing about the toll that opioid use, abuse, and overdose has taken. And even as a social worker, I have not thought, I bet there's some, grandparents or parents who are getting exploited because the money has to come from somewhere. They may have been prescribed opioids for all we know. It's so interesting how it has such a ripple effect.
Exactly right. And it's also sort of shocking to me how little research there is. And one of the things that we've done in Maine is to collect data because we want to, as we all learned in math in grade school, we want to show our work. And it's not easy. It's often a very arduous process, but it's super important to us. I mean, I feel like there's an ethical obligation. If we're going to put a new program into the world, we have to be able to say, how does this work?
And you're using taxpayers' money, I suspect.
Yes. So, well, initially, actually, the thing that's really exciting is that, yes, we got a grant from HHS, but it was both APS and the nonprofit, well, not just both, APS and the clients and the community liked it so much that Maine's governor wrote RISE into the permanent healthy aging budget, proposed it to include it in the permanent healthy aging budget, which for me is...
That's the ultimate.
That's the ultimate. And it was because of the strong pilot data, which is just, making the connection between that kind of sustainability and success and why it's important to collect the data and to show our work is very exciting to us.
I hear the excitement in your voice, and I wonder if this feels like legacy work for you, that this is something that you are going to leave behind.
Well, it's funny. I haven't thought of it that way because mostly I feel like my legacy work has been less than successful. I mean, it was working on the Elder Justice Act, which I had all kinds of great hopes and aspirations for, but didn't really turn out as anywhere near as successful as I had hoped. That drove me to writing this book. So we'll see. I mean, what we're about, and I'm working with a fantastic team of researchers and practitioners and innovators. But our hope is to change paradigms and systems and knowledge about more hopeful ways to intervene and to intervene further upstream, really, because what we're hoping to do is really also move toward better understanding of prevention, because we don't know very much really about how to prevent a lot of these problems that cause so much suffering and that are also super expensive for society.
It seems like you've gone back a little bit before you went to law school and had an appreciation of mental illness and substance abuse. I'm sure at that time it might not have been opioids, but so some of that exposure is probably helpful now, because you are dealing with the whole, as you say, it's holistic. It's the whole system. It's the whole family. And if the grandchild is a substance abuser, that's going to have great impact. And if we can help that person stay in recovery, boy, what a positive ripple effect that will have on the family and the community.
Exactly right. And so that's what we have done after building this RISE program in Maine, is we're trying to expand it to other systems. And so we have now expanded it in one case to the criminal justice system. And as one of the people that I write about in my book is a criminal prosecutor in Seattle who's a very thoughtful and innovative elder abuse prosecutor named Paige Ulrey, who's been bringing these kinds of cases for more than 20 years, and has seen that a lot of times what she has to offer is not what the victims in her cases want. So in a recent case, it was that prototypical kind of case involving a grandmother who had been financially exploited and threatened by her grandson. And she didn't want the grandson to be prosecuted. She wanted to get him help.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been an addict for many, many years. And so what we did is, and this is very early on in this case, but essentially use the RISE program in conjunction with drug court in King County, Washington, to essentially bring some new kind of infrastructure to this kind of case. And so the grandson was charged, and if he complies with all of the requirements of both the both drug court and then the restorative approaches of the RISE program, then Paige will drop her charges against him. And
it's so it's so intelligent and compassionate.
That's right. And the grandmother was so thrilled. When Paige called to tell her that he had been admitted to the program, she wept. And it's just, it's very hopeful. And then he went into inpatient treatment, and now he's in clean and sober housing. And we all have our fingers crossed that this will be a more transformative resolution to what was a very, a very troublesome problem that caused suffering, not just also for the grandmother and the grandson, but for the other family members who were divided by this whole situation. So, and I think that's the power of restorative justice, because it focuses on harm reduction and transformation.
Right.
And also on accountability, on meaningful forms of accountability,
Okay.
but also in the elder justice field. And, one of the things, Patty Kimball, who runs the nonprofit in Maine and who's an expert also in restorative justice, has really taught me that it's not like cookie cutter restorative justice. It's using the restorative practices in elder abuse cases is both high risk and high reward, because often, there's a lot going on. Many of the victims are very vulnerable. And so it has to be approached with a lot of guardrails and a lot of caution. And so we use what we call a restorative approach. It's not the same as restorative justice. And we're still building it and studying it, but the early results are very promising.
It sounds also so rewarding for people like you who are designing these programs and seeing how they end differently than just having a punitive approach.
You're exactly right. And that's, I started off as a prosecutor, and, to a prosecutor, prosecution is it's like a hammer and everything looks like a nail, right? But in cases like that is looked like the solution. And over time, you ask, like, what's the goal here? And there's clearly a role for the justice system in these kinds of cases, but there's also often an unrealized role to kind of raise the lens and move further upstream and say, what are the remedies that we have available to us to help people avoid these kinds of problems? Like, how do we help them? How do we help caregivers better so that they don't run into trouble and they don't get overwhelmed and there isn't terrible conflict in families? And how do we help older people think ahead and, put in place the kinds of guardrails that can really help prevent trouble? And, I know you've had on Joshua Coleman on estrangement. Like estrangement can really exacerbate these kinds of problems, and it can also be caused by our lack of preparation for aging. I mean, sometimes families. My friend and colleague Carl Pillemer, who's a professor at Cornell, has also written a book about estrangement, and he has examples there about how sort of different visions of caregiving have led to estrangement among siblings, which is another kind of tragedy and fallout.
Oh my goodness. It's so complex.
It's really complex.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be like, I feel like it's important for me also to say that we also miss another kind of, I think, low-hanging fruit in that our approach to aging is so, it's so focused on the puzzles of it and on the, on the money and the care and the systems and the insurance, that we often forget to ask, how do we derive meaning from old age? And how do we make those sacred additional years that we have been given matter? And how do we fill them with activity and, make sure that exactly, with zest and with connection and with purpose.
Yes.
And with awe.
And yes.
And there are ways to do that. There are very concrete ways to do that. I was as surprised as anybody that that's where I ended up writing toward. That's the last chapter of my book focuses on how do we make meaning of time, and that there's huge potential, I think, if we can really bring ourselves to think about it more. And that's also prevention. It's also prevention if we can think about it. So I'll give you an example. A lot of financial exploitation, I think, comes into play because when we're talking about scammers, for example, because people want purpose in their lives. So when somebody calls and either pretends to be interested in them or have some new cool business scheme or whatever, I think people often want something to, they want something bigger to be part of. And especially when older people are very isolated or lonely, those kinds of scammers can have a profound impact. And so if we focus more on how to make sure that we have purposeful activity throughout all of life, I think that could be prevention also.
That's very interesting. I had never made that connection. Yeah, and also you're just healthy, not only the purpose part, but if you're stimulated and you're social and you're doing things that interest you, your brain is just more, the connections are happening.
Absolutely. Actually, it is. There's very concrete data about the health benefits. There's a guy named Steve Cole at UCLA who studies the biological pathways by which social environments influence gene expression. And it's really, really clear that purpose and connection improve our health.
I just interviewed Patrick Hill, who's a neuropsychologist at Washington University in St. Louis, and that's what he does. That's his whole approach, or his whole focus is how does purpose and also gratitude impact longevity, and it's real.
It's very, very real. I work with, I don't know if the term creative engagement is something that you have. I know you've had artists on and people who talk about the benefit of art. And my friend and colleague, Ann Basting, who...
I interviewed Ann.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, she's amazing. She's a force of nature. But I think, creative engagement is also a way to kind of shift the paradigm and really look at, not at all the losses of aging, but at what potential remains.
Mm-hmm.
Laura Mosqueda, who's a geriatrician at USC and one of the other people I write about in the book, and I took a road trip to go see Anne, one of the plays that Anne put on at a nursing home in Kentucky, a play called Wendy's Neverland. And it was a very moving and inspiring experience to see how the residents and the artists and the staff all came together to produce a theatrical production.
I remember her describing this, and it sounded magical.
It was incredible. It's really, it was really incredible. Yeah. And I think it's, in a way, we've worked so hard at the science part of getting older, but we've had kind of an impoverishment of our imaginative potential. Like we haven't really thought enough about how to inhabit old age in ways that are positive and meaningful. There are people like Anne and many people who I'm sure you've interviewed who are there to help us do that in a more effective way.
That's what I'm hoping. That's sort of the whole mission of Zestful Aging. I wanted to make sure our audience knew where to find you and find out more about your book.
Oh, well, thanks. My book is coming out on July 18th, and it's called The Measure of Our Age. And there are a bunch of resources for people at the in one of the appendices, but I also have resources and much expanded endnotes on my website, which is mtconnelly.com. Mm-hmm. So I invite people to take a look at those.
Take a look,
yeah, we need more help. We need to deploy the resources in our families and in our individual lives, and also I think as policymakers and as a culture, we need to really think about how we're going to be better prepared for a better old age, both the and both the downsides, the potential downsides, and the potential upsides, so that we can realize its potential more.
Absolutely. I can't agree more. Thank you so much for talking to us about all of these factors and all of these dimensions, that many of them are intertwined. I loved hearing about the initiative Rise in Maine, and I wish you great success. And I hope that is duplicated all over. It just makes so much sense. Thank you so much, MT. Really appreciate your time and your energy.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for providing a platform for people to talk about these important issues. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on Zestful Aging. If you like the podcast, please share it with some of your friends. If you think decluttering could help you feel better and you could use a little assistance with that, check out the online course I've developed with professional organizer and designer Carrie Luderin. It's called Too Much Stuff. And too much stuff is different from other courses or articles or guidance you may have used up. We give you clear steps to deal with the clutter and the tools to help you face the overwhelming feelings and the emotions that come up when we're going through our clutter. And a lot of those emotions are just feeling anxious or guilty or just basically flooded with a lot of different confusing feelings. The course is really practical. It's realistic. The lessons are short and punchy, and they're really manageable. We're not trying to set you up for some long exploratory, super in-depth, burdensome experience. We want something really helpful for you right now. We all need help with our anxiety. So being surrounded by more calm and less chaos can really help. So now's a good time to clear out the clutter so we can focus on what's really important in our lives. So find out more at zestfulaging.com. You'll see more about this under the web courses tab. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email at zestfulaging@gmail.com. Thanks so much. And stay tuned next week for another interview with a fascinating and inspiring guest.